I'm Ryan, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past. What if the architect of Anne Boleyn's dramatic rise and terrifying vulnerability wasn't just an obsessed king, but the very man who gave her life? Close your eyes. Breathe in the damp, cold stone of the tower walls, masked poorly by the heavy, suffocating scent of myrrh and burning incense. Can you hear the slow, deliberate rustle of heavy silk brushing against ancient polished floors? This wasn't merely a royal court. It was a grand theatrical performance. It was a gilded cage, where every curated smile was a calculated move, and young women trapped in an internal monologue of quiet desperation knew they were viewed as little more than exquisite, breathing property. For Anne, the comforting illusion of paternal protection was shattered early. The mask of a loving father was worn seamlessly by Thomas Boleyn, a man who treated sacred family bonds exclusively as political currency. What the history books don't tell you is how deep and dangerously this ambition truly ran. Forget the exaggerated myths of secret Vatican seals and shadowy fictionalized conspiracies. The truth is actually far more unsettling in its bureaucratic reality. Surviving ambassadorial records, buried among Thomas's verified diplomatic correspondence from the early 1500s, paint a chilling, factual portrait. These pristine ambassadorial records reveal a man meticulously calculating his own bloodline's ascent. He wasn't a passive father caught in Henry VIII's tempestuous wake. Thomas was the chief navigator, charting a ruthless course for power. He dressed his daughters in the finest imported fabrics and tutored them in the dangerous art of aristocratic allure, pushing them onto the deadly stage of Europe's elite. He traded his children's innocence for titles, wealth, and proximity to the throne. But as the dark ink dried on those early diplomatic dispatches, an even more perilous machination was already set into motion. When the king's eyes finally fixed upon the younger Boleyn girl, was it romantic fate or an opportunity quickly seized by an ambitious patriarch? And more importantly, what calculated maneuver was Thomas driving to leverage this royal obsession for his own elevation? Step closer into the shadows. Can you feel the creeping chill of the cold stone of the tower walls? Breathe in. That lingering scent of burning incense and dry, old parchment is the very perfume of ambition. Welcome to the pawn's cradle. Imagine being born not as a living, breathing child, but as currency. For Anne and Mary Boleyn, childhood was merely a waiting room for the grand performance of courtly survival. Beneath the luxurious rustle of heavy silk, Anne harbored a profound, silent alienation. She was trapped in a system that viewed her entirely as royal property. From her very first steps at Heever Castle, she was groomed exclusively as a political asset, taught to meticulously craft a mask of poised obedience for a role she never chose. What the history books don't tell you is how terrifyingly clinical this patriarchal machinery was. If we peel back the layers and examine the historical household records of Heever Castle, we do not find the warmth of a father's affection. Instead, we see calculating ledgers, exhaustive payments for elite French tutors, exorbitant sums for imported velvet, and the finest lute strings. Thomas Boleyn was not raising a daughter, he was polishing an investment. Every single penny spent was a rigorously calculated stake expected to yield a monumental return. But Thomas knew the English board was simply too small for his ambition. He cast his gaze across the sea. Surviving correspondence from 1513 reveals the meticulous diplomatic exchange between Thomas and Margaret of Austria, one of the most formidable regents in Europe. Through these delicate negotiations, Thomas clinically orchestrated Anne's placement in Margaret's prestigious court. It was never a plea for a young girl's education. It was a highly strategic positioning to secure familial influence abroad. Thomas was embedding his bloodline deep into the continent's elite power structures. Anne was thrust into the dark, glittering machinery of European diplomacy, forced to learn the silent language of power before she even understood what it meant to be traded. She mastered the game in the shadowed halls of the Habsburgs, entirely unaware that her father was already plotting her next move. But what happens when the perfect, obedient pawn catches the eye of a volatile king who desires more than just a political alliance? The hidden financial roles of the French royal court are about to expose a terrifying new gambit. Step closer into the shadows. Listen to the hiss of heavy silk dragging across the cold stone floors of the court. Smell the intoxicating, suffocating blend of heavy incense and the sharp, brittle scent of old parchment. Welcome to the Tudor Privy Chamber, a gilded spiderweb where every glittering jewel is a snare and every polished smile hides a blade. Anne Boleyn had ascended. She had breached the king's inner circle. But what the history books don't tell you is the crushing psychological weight of this survival performance. To exist within Henry's private apartments was to be subjected to strict, isolating spatial protocols. The Privy Chamber was a fortress of etiquette, a series of increasingly secluded rooms designed to restrict access and weaponize favor. Anne was not just a queen in waiting, she was a prized captive, completely sealed off from the outside world alongside treacherous allies whose silence was absolute. Within these claustrophobic walls, the darkest paranoia took root. The most chilling realization was not the danger posed by her enemies, but the dawning comprehension of who had placed her in this trap. It was Thomas Boleyn, her own father, who had so meticulously woven the very political web now suffocating her. He had traded his flesh and blood for the heavy gold chains of earldoms, treating his daughters as nothing more than exquisite, negotiable property. The mask of royalty had to be flawless. Anne's internal monologue must have been a ceaseless, frantic drumbeat of survival. One misplaced word, one sigh of exhaustion, and the wolves would strike. According to the verified dispatches of Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, the court was a theater of deceit. Chapuis observed her every move, noting how she was forced to dance, laugh, and play the untouchable siren while entirely surrounded by spies. Even her father's eyes tracked her, not with paternal warmth, but with the cold calculation of an investor watching his primary asset. She was trapped in a masterpiece of her father's design, entirely alone in a crowded room. But how long can anyone sustain a flawless performance when the stage itself is beginning to rot beneath their feet? As we are about to see, the true cost of this ambition wasn't paid in gold. It was exacted in the chilling legal technicalities of the king's hidden tribunal. Welcome back to the shadows. Lean in closer. Can you feel the chill radiating from the damp, centuries-old stone? Hear the devastating roar of the Tower of London's iron gates slamming shut? It is a sound that echoes through eternity, the sound of a trap springing on a queen. It is May 1536. The scent of sweet, suffocating incense and the musty decay of rotting parchment hang heavy in the air of the courtroom. The rustle of heavy silk, once a sound of regal majesty, now sounds like the hissing of vipers to condemned ears. Anne Boleyn, a woman who wore the crown of England, realizes the terrifying truth. She is not a monarch here. She is property, a broken pawn on a shattered chessboard. Her entire life has been a meticulously crafted performance of calculated grace, masked by a dazzling smile. But in the echoing chambers of the tower walls, the mask finally cracks in the face of absolute doom. What the history books don't tell you is the quietest, most agonizing betrayal of all. When the official trial records of 1536 are laid bare, the silence of Thomas Boleyn is deafening. Officially, Thomas was conveniently excused from sitting in judgment of his own flesh and blood, Anne and George. A mercy, some might say? A grieving father spared the unthinkable agony? No. Look closer at the ink and the men who held the quills. Thomas preserved his glittering status through a sickening act of self-preserving acquiescence. He served on the very commission that condemned Anne's co-accused, men like Norris, Weston, and Smeaton. By signing their death warrants, Thomas effectively sealed his own daughter's fate. If they were legally guilty of high treason with the Queen was guilty by default. He traded his children's lives for his own survival. It was a calculated abandonment, a crushing psychological trauma that Anne must have felt in the marrow of her bones as she awaited the executioner's sword. Contemporary dispatches from foreign ambassadors hint at the sheer pragmatism of a Tudor court steeped in terror, revealing men who masked their panic with cold, bureaucratic compliance. Thomas draped himself in the heavy velvet of duty, his heart locked behind an impenetrable guise, sacrificing his most valuable assets to appease a despotic king. The psychological weight of the 1536 trials wasn't just in the tragic execution on Tower Green. It was in the devastating silence of a father who stepped aside to let the axe fall. Thomas Boleyn walked out of the nightmare alive, his titles intact, though forever stained with the blood of his children. He played the ultimate game of survival and won the darkest prize. But what is the true cost of breathing when your legacy is buried headless in an elm arrow chest? What happens to a man who sells his soul to survive when the crown decides it is no longer amused? As the dust settles on the scaffold, another, even darker reckoning awaits in the technical financial ledgers of the Boleyn estate. Close your eyes, breathe in the scent of stale incense and the crumbling dust of old parchment. Press your palms against the cold stone of the tower walls. This is where the grand performance of the Tudor court meets its haunting, undeniable silence. For Thomas Boleyn, life was a meticulously choreographed masquerade, a relentless staging of ambition, where daughters were merely exquisite properties, traded across the chessboard of Europe for titles and estates. He molded Anne into the perfect pawn, teaching her to wear the mask of regal compliance and seductive wit in a system that demanded total submission. What the history books don't tell you is the sheer, desperate violence of her erasure. Following her execution, Henry VIII dispatched masons with hammers to violently gouge Anne's crowned falcon heraldry out of the palace masonry. The stone chips fell like snow onto empty gallery floors, a forced suppression meant to leave behind only an eerie quiet. History seemed ready to cast its final damning judgment on a father's hollow ambition. Yet Thomas's myopic power game ironically birthed a force that transcended his mortal control. Decades later, the heavy rustle of golden silk swept across the stone floors of Westminster. The triumphant coronation records of Elizabeth I, Anne's orphaned daughter, serve as the historical world's ultimate vindication against her family's tragic exploitation. Her sheer, radiant existence was the ultimate defiance. Surviving state papers from the Elizabethan era hint at the lingering paranoia among the old nobility. The chilling realization that the Boleyn blood had not been eradicated, but elevated to absolute, unstoppable sovereignty. The silent victory belonged solely to Anne, her immortalized historical impact echoing far louder than the chisels of her enemies. We are left looking back into the shadows to ask, was Thomas Boleyn a master strategist, or a father blinded by a power game he couldn't control? The truth may just be hidden in the surviving, blood-stained ledgers of the Royal Exchequer. Join us in the next chapter as we decode the secret financial accounts that finally reveal the true, shocking price Henry paid